Lesson 12, Part 3, the Imperfect Active Indicative. The imperfect active indicative, abbreviated IAI, is the equivalent of the English past progressive. I was walking, she was walking, they were going, we were wanting. Because the imperfect active indicative is a progressive tense, it has the same stem as present active indicative verbs do, called the progressive stem, or also called the first principal part. Other tenses that we'll learn later have different stems. You don't really need to worry about that for the moment, other than to realize that present active indicative and present middle passive indicative and imperfect active indicative and imperfect middle passive indicative all take the first principal part or the progressive stem. Those mean the same thing. There are, however, two main differences between the imperfect active indicative and the present active indicative: an augment and different endings. Consider the imperfect active indicative. We have elegan, I was saying, eleges, you were saying, elege, he was saying. Elegamen, we were saying, elegete, ye were saying, and elegan, they were saying. Now you'll notice we have the stem leg in the middle. That's from Lego. That means to say. We found the stem of Lego by taking off the omega. We were left with the leg. That's the exact same. Nothing has changed there. But now we've got different endings. We have on, es, e, amen, ete, an. Now the amen and the ete are exactly the same. Absolutely no change has happened whatsoever there. For the S and the E, the iota has just dropped out. But we still have S and we still have E that was in the ace and the A. Now what's really tricky is we have on here in the first person singular and we have on here in the third person plural. Neither of them looks like O or usi, but that's a new ending that we're going to need to fully memorize. So you can memorize this as on, es, e, amen, ete, an. It might be better though to memorize the whole word together, because you'll notice there's also this extra letter at the beginning, this epsilon at the beginning. It's called an augment. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. As I said, note that the first person singular and third person plural are the same form. But it's normally pretty easy to tell by context which one is which. If you have a subject that's plural, then it's going to be a third person plural. If you don't have a subject, it's normally pretty clear to tell by context, though it is possible if you have no context that you can't tell at all. Even if you have context, it is hypothetically possible that it would be, impossible to tell, but that's really, really rare. Also note the third person singular can take a movable nu. As far as I'm aware, this is the only type of thing that where an epsilon will take a movable nu. Normally it's an iota, but it can occur there. So just watch out for that. Don't let that throw you if you see one of those. The endings we learned on the present active indicative are called primary A endings. That was the O, U, oase, amen, ete, usi. Those were all called primary A endings, just to give them a name. The endings on the imperfect active indicative are called secondary A endings. There are also primary B and secondary B endings that we'll learn later. These are the main four sets of endings that we'll see on almost all of our verbs. There are a few others. There are a couple of imperfect A and B endings, and there's an optative A set of endings. But for almost all of the verbs that we will ever see in Greek in all of the verb tenses, almost all of them will take either primary A or primary B, secondary A or secondary B endings. So here we have primary A and secondary A. The epsilon before the stem is called an augment. We find an augment on all indicative tenses that take secondary endings. Now, the ones that take secondary endings and the ones that have augments, they all sort of go together. They're always past tenses. There are actually three past tenses in Greek. We have the imperfect active indicative, or the imperfect that we're looking at here. We have the aorist tense, which is sort of like the simple past. And then we have the pluperfect, which is a past perfect tense. All three of them are past tenses. So they take an augment and they take secondary endings. Those three things go together: past tense, secondary endings, augment. Those all go together. Now, but they only get an augment in the indicative, technically in the indicative mood. We won't learn any more moods until like the middle of Greek 2, but just so you have that in the back of your mind, this only happens with indicatives. It doesn't happen with like imperatives when you're giving a command, or subjunctives when you're talking about like an if statement. They don't show up there. So to make a formula for our tenses, we can say that the present active indicative is the first stem plus primary A endings. The imperfect active indicative is an augment plus the first stem plus secondary A endings. Now, technically, there is one more piece. We can split these endings into two different pieces, but we won't do that until Greek 2, just to not confuse you for now. We're going to finish sort of learning some things first, and then we'll sort of get a little bit more nitpicky here. But for now, this can sort of help us out. When we have a verb, we can break it down into its pieces and say, okay, which tense is it? Well, is it first stem and primary A, or is it augment first stem and secondary A? And that'll tell us what the tense is. Note, when translating the imperfect active indicative, you will translate using was or were with the verb in the ing form, such as I was going. Now, there are a couple of weird things that happen with augments. This is one of students' favorite things. It's actually not too bad if you pay close attention to what's going on, but if you don't get this idea firmly in your mind, it can be confusing for a long time. So try to really grasp this concept here. If the verb begins with a vowel, instead of adding an epsilon, the vowel lengthens. Now I don't think we've talked about vowel length very much before. We've said before that Greek has 7 vowels. 3 of them, they form their own long. The vowel itself can be long or short. Not omega. Iota is like that. Iota can be short or it can be long, just depending on what it's doing. But then other vowels, there's a pair of them. One of them is the short version and one of them is the long version. Epsilon and eta do this. Epsilon is a short vowel and eta is a long vowel, and they're actually sort of kind of the same vowel, just in 2 different forms. We've got a short form and we've got a long form. I know they show up differently in the alphabet. They have, there's actually 2 different letters. So our English minds don't really like that concept, because we, when we were growing up, maybe we had, there's A and it has a short form is A and a long form is A, and you have to know how to read it properly. Well, Greek didn't want to make you have to learn how to read it properly and guess based on the context for these. And, one letter has 2 different pronunciations. So there's actually 2 different forms for the same vowel. An epsilon is going to become an eta. So if we've got an epsilon here, looking at what we're doing with augments, if there's an epsilon at the beginning of a verb, and we need to add an augment, instead of adding another epsilon, the epsilon that's in the stem of the vowel is going to lengthen and become an eta. An omicron is going to become an omega. Now, an alpha should stay the same, because the alpha is both a short and a long vowel, but alpha is a little bit funny. Sometimes when it's supposed to lengthen, it actually becomes an eta, and that's what it does here. So you'll notice both an epsilon and an alpha become an eta, and an omicron becomes an omega. Iota stays the same and upsilon stays the same, and that actually makes all 7 of our vowels there. So ago, the stem of which is ag, the O is for the first person singular, ago becomes agon. The alpha lengthens into an eta. You'll notice the breathings are the same though. Iro becomes aron. Now, of course, don't let the O's and the ons throw you off. That's because this is imperfect active indicative first singular. This is present active indicative first singular, so different endings. So we've got ire becoming air. Now note how the iota became a subscript. Long vowels, eta, omega, and sometimes alpha, not always alpha, because alpha is not always long. Eta, omega, and Sometimes alpha, the iota will subscript, but for eta and omega, it always has to. So here the iota has subscripted. Akuo becomes akuon. Agero becomes ageron. Here we have an epsilon lengthening into an eta. Now, if you see one of these and you're not sure what it is, first thing you're going to do is look at this verb and say, I don't know an agero, or I don't know an akuo. Okay, is it possible that there's an augment? I see an eta. Okay, well, let's try it out. Let's try both an alpha and an epsilon and see if I know a verb like that. I'll replace the on with o. So do I know agero? I don't think so. Do I know agero? Oh, yes, I do know agero. That's I raise up. So that's what that one is. This one comes from an epsilon. So that's how you can parse these and sort of figure out what's going on with them. Estheo becomes astheo. Again, the epsilon lengthens into an eta. Heurisco, that should be a rough breathing there, becomes heuriscon. Diphthongs are already long, so diphthongs stay exactly the same. Now, you might look at this and go, but how do I know that it's imperfect? Because it still has an imperfect ending. It still has a secondary B ending. And it sort of has an augment. The augment is that it lengthened, but it was already long, so nothing changed. A little bit weird, but that's how it is. Now, this one is very strange. Echo becomes acon. This one is very weird because there used to be a sigma at the beginning of this word. It used to be secho. And when you have a sigma between two vowels, the sigma drops out. And those two epsilons actually sort of blended together. So it's very strange. It's echan. So watch out for that one. It's very strange. It might throw you. The only thing you really have to go off of is the he in the middle. So really keep an eye on that one. You'll want to memorize that one. Fellow becomes athalon. Now, this one is an exception. We would expect the augment to be an epsilon, but it's an eta. Why? I don't know. It's just what happens in Greek. Languages don't always follow their own rules, so memorize that one. So to sort of sum up, epsilons and alphas, if they're at if the stem starts with an epsilon or an alpha, instead of adding an epsilon to the beginning for the augment, we're going to lengthen the vowel. Epsilon and alphas become eta. Omicrons become omega. We don't actually have any examples of those because we haven't learned any vowels that or verbs that begin with omicron yet, but there are a few of them in Greek, not very many though. Now, here's where it gets really tricky. If the verb begins with a preposition, the augment goes between the preposition and the verb stem. If the preposition ends with a vowel, that vowel has to drop out. And occasionally, the consonant at the end of the preposition will change slightly. Now, these last two rules, we've sort of seen them already in a different context. We've seen contraction with our prepositions. If they're two syllables and they end with an omicron or an alpha, the omicron or alpha will drop before another vowel. That's the same thing that's going on here, except the preposition is attached to the verb, but it is actually technically still two words, even though it's all together and there's no space in there. Then we've seen before, like appa became af, or epi became f, or kata became kath. We've seen that happen before. It's not as common to happen here, but there are a few that do that. So for example, appa cateno. We've got appa, and we've got cateno. Now, you may not have realized that that's two separate words because it just all together means die. It doesn't really have any idea of from in it anymore. It used to when this word first got coined. But we have appa and we have cateno. So this is appa plus cateno. When we add an epsilon, then we have appa and then ekatenon, proper ending there. Appa ekatenon. We don't want two vowels next to each other. So this omicron drops out and we've got op ekatenon. So We'll need to know that for when we form these verbs, when we conjugate them. We'll also need to know this for our parsing, because if you look at the beginning, it's not going to look like it has an augment until you realize, oh, this is a preposition at the beginning. There is an augment here. You can also know it's imperfect active indicative, though, because of the ending, but this will sort of help us out, especially as we get further and more complicated into Greek in the future. So anabino becomes an ebainon. Now, we haven't learned ana as a preposition yet. It means up or again, which is why anabino means I go up. So ana, the alpha drops, and the epsilon is in there for the augment. Anoigo is, again, another form of ana, and then we've got oigo. The alpha already dropped for the ana when it got joined to this word, but here's really weird. The epsilon actually goes right there. This lengthens, which is very, 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 very strange, and the iota subscripted. So you probably will want to memorize that one. It's very, very, very strange. Then we've got apathenesco. Again, you might not have realized that this has a preposition at the beginning, apa, but the omicron will drop when we add an epsilon for the augment. Apocateno, we mentioned above. Omicron drops when we add the epsilon for the augment. Apaluo, again, omicron drops when we have an epsilon for an augment. Ekbalo becomes ex-ebalon. Now, this one here didn't have a vowel to drop out, but there is this consonant change of the kappa becoming the xi. This happens anytime ek is a prefix and an augment is added. Later we'll learn ex erkomai or ek peruomai will become ex peru, that kind of thing. Anytime ek is a preposition and there's an augment, or really anytime there's a vowel after it, it becomes X. Katabino becomes katebainon, so the alpha dropped out and we got an epsilon in there for the augment. Soon ago, okay, drop off the soon and we just have ago. Now there's no vowel to drop there because the is not part of the preposition. Is part of the stem, so soon and ago. So this needs to lengthen because it begins with a vowel. But we're not sticking the augment over here at the beginning because this is a preposition. So sort of split those two in your mind. Pretty much anytime you're adding an augment and there's a preposition, split off that preposition first, add the augment, then check to see if the preposition needs to change. And follow the regular rules for adding augment, which of course includes lengthening that vowel if you've got one at the beginning. This is apa and ago. The omicron has already dropped. The alpha is part of the stem of the verb, so the alpha needs to lengthen. This is from hupa and arco, so the omicron drops out. Omicron has already dropped out. The alpha is part of the stem for arco, and so it's going to lengthen to hoop aircon. So summary. The imperfect active indicative in Greek corresponds to the past progressive in English. The imperfect active indicative is formed using the first principal part or progressive stem, the same as the present active indicative. The present active indicative is formed with primary A endings. The imperfect active indicative is formed with secondary A endings. Present active indicative equals first stem plus primary A endings. Imperfect active indicative equals augment plus first stem plus secondary A endings. In the imperfect active indicative, an augment is added to the beginning. This happens in all secondary tenses. If a verb begins with a vowel, the augment will cause the vowel to lengthen. If a verb begins with a preposition, the augment goes between the preposition and the stem. If the preposition ends with a vowel, that vowel is dropped. Occasionally, the consonant at the end of the preposition will change slightly. The imperfect active indicative first person singular form of echo is echan. The imperfect active indicative first singular form of airo is aaron. The imperfect active indicative first person singular form of fellow is athelon. When translating the imperfect active indicative, you will translate using was or were with the verb in the ing form, such as I was going. Some minute details. Here's a chart that you can sort of pause the video and take a close look at. Here's exactly what's happening with each of these prepositions, verbs with prepositions sort of slowed down and sort of described out very carefully, so you can see exactly what's happening with them. I'm not going to go through and read all of them since we sort of just did that, but you can pause the video here and take a close look or look at it on the screen in Canvas.